Officer James Parker patrolled the quiet streets of Cedar Grove on a humid summer evening, his mind clouded by old prejudices and misconceptions. As he turned onto Maple Street, he spotted a black BMW with slightly tinted windows. Without any real cause, he flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. Behind the wheel sat Sarah Johnson, a respected pediatric surgeon heading home after a 12-hour shift at Cedar Grove Memorial Hospital. She remained calm, having experienced similar situations before. As she reached for her license and registration with steady hands, Officer Parker approached her window with his hand resting on his holster. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, without even asking for her documents. Sarah, exhausted but composed, tried explaining she had just finished saving the young child's life in surgery. The officer wouldn't listen. His voice grew louder as he ordered her out again, his face twisted with unwarranted suspicion. Sarah attempted to film the interaction with her phone, but Parker roughly yanked her car door open. In the chaos that followed, she was dragged from her vehicle despite her medical ID badge clearly visible on her scrubs. The commotion drew the attention of several bystanders, including teenager Miguel Rodriguez, who started recording everything on his phone. What Officer Parker didn't realize was that the young boy whose life Sarah had saved just hours ago was his own nephew, Tommy. The 6-year-old had been rushed to the hospital with a ruptured appendix, and it was Sarah's skilled hands that had performed the emergency surgery. She'd stayed 2 hours after her shift to ensure Tommy's recovery was stable. As Parker handcuffed Sarah, a familiar voice pierced the tense atmosphere. "James, what are you doing to Dr. Johnson?" His sister, Emma, ran toward them from the coffee shop across the street. She had been heading to the hospital to bring flowers to Sarah, the doctor who had saved her son's life. The color drained from Officer Parker's face as Emma explained who Sarah was. The same woman he was treating like a criminal had spent hours ensuring his nephew would live to see another birthday. The growing crowd of onlookers shook their heads in disappointment, many recognizing Sarah from her years of service to their community. The body camera footage told a damning story of prejudice. While Miguel's viral videos spread rapidly across social media, more people arrived at the scene, many of them parents whose children had been treated by Dr. Johnson over the years. They demanded answers, their phones recording every moment of Parker's transformation from aggressive officer to a man realizing the massive error in his judgment. In those brief minutes, Officer Parker's world shifted dramatically. The woman he had profiled and mistreated wasn't just another civilian. She was a highly respected doctor, a pillar of the community, and most importantly, his nephew's savior. The revenge wasn't physical. It was the crushing weight of his own prejudices being exposed in front of everyone who knew him. Sarah stood dignified as the handcuffs were removed, her fellow citizens forming a protective circle around her. She hadn't raised her voice once during the entire ordeal, her composure a stark contrast to Parker's earlier aggression. The real power lay not in physical force, but in the undeniable truth that had shattered his biased worldview. Parents began sharing stories of how Dr. Johnson had helped their children, many speaking through tears. Each word felt like a heavy blow to Parker's pride and prejudice, more devastating than any physical retaliation could have been. The true revenge was the mirror held up to his actions, forcing him to confront the ugliness of his assumptions in front of his entire community. The incident would change not just one officer's perspective, but spark a larger conversation about racial profiling in Cedar Grove. As Sarah finally drove away, surrounded by supporters, she had accomplished something remarkable, teaching a powerful lesson without ever throwing a punch or raising her voice. The next day, the incident had spread like wildfire through Cedar Grove. Local news stations camped outside the hospital where Dr. Sarah Johnson continued her work, unfazed by the previous night's events. Her colleagues rallied around her, sharing their own stories of similar experiences, but what struck everyone was how she remained focused on her patients despite the chaos. Officer Parker sat in the police chief's office, his badge and gun placed on the desk between them. The chief, an African-American woman named Patricia Mills, played both the body camera footage and the viral video that had already reached millions of views. Parker's sister Emma sat beside him, still wearing the same disappointed expression from the night before. "My son would be dead if it wasn't for Dr. Johnson," Emma said quietly, tears rolling down her cheeks. "And this is how you repay her." The words cut deeper than any reprimand from his superiors could. Chief Mills had known Sarah for years. Their children attended the same school, and Sarah had volunteered countless hours at community health fairs. Meanwhile, at Cedar Grove Memorial, Sarah was performing another critical surgery. As she worked to save another young life, the waiting room filled with people, not just patients' families, but community members showing support. They brought flowers, cards, and stories of how she had touched their lives. Among them was Tommy, Parker's nephew, still recovering but insisting on coming to thank his doctor. The police department faced mounting pressure as the video continued spreading. More stories emerged of similar incidents, and protesters gathered outside the station. But unlike other protests, these weren't just activist groups. They were doctors, nurses, teachers, and parents, many holding signs with pictures of their children who Dr. Johnson had saved over the years. Officer Parker couldn't sleep that night, haunted by the realization that his actions weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern he'd never acknowledged before. He watched interviews of Sarah on the news, where she spoke not about revenge or punishment, but about the need for understanding and change. Her words weren't angry. They were thoughtful and measured, making them even more powerful. The story took an unexpected turn when Sarah received an emergency call about a critical patient, a young girl involved in a terrible accident. As she rushed to the hospital, she encountered a police roadblock. The officer who approached her car was none other than Parker's partner, who had witnessed the previous night's events. Without hesitation, he provided her with a police escort to the hospital, lights flashing to clear her path. In the operating room, Sarah worked tirelessly to save the young girl, not knowing it was the daughter of one of the officers who had backed up Parker during the traffic stop. The same man who had stood by silently now sat in the waiting room, praying that Dr. Johnson would show his daughter more compassion than they had shown her. Hours later, as Sarah emerged from surgery, exhausted but successful, she found the waiting room full of both police officers and community members. The division that had seemed so stark the night before began to blur as people shared their fears, hopes, and stories. The young girl's father, still in his uniform, broke down in tears as he thanked her. This wave of change reached Officer Parker, who watched from the hospital chapel as Sarah comforted the crying officer. He realized that true strength wasn't in his badge or gun, but in the ability to acknowledge mistakes and work toward genuine change. The revenge wasn't in punishment or public shame. It was in the undeniable evidence that his actions had been absolutely wrong, displayed through Sarah's unwavering professionalism and humanity. The day ended with a powerful image. Dr. Johnson treating a line of patients, including several police officers' family members, while outside her window, the community continued its peaceful gathering, showing that the best response to prejudice isn't violence but persistent, undeniable proof of human dignity. A week after the incident, Cedar Grove was still feeling its aftershocks. The police department announced mandatory sensitivity training, but it was what happened in the hospital's cafeteria that truly began changing hearts and minds. Dr. Sarah Johnson sat across from Officer Parker, who had requested this meeting through his sister Emma. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Parker's hands trembled as he held his coffee cup, unable to meet Sarah's steady gaze. His nephew Tommy sat beside him, still recovering but insistent on being present. The boy reached out and took both Sarah's and his uncle's hands, creating an unexpected bridge between them. The simple gesture from a child brought tears to several onlookers' eyes. "My mommy says you were scared," Tommy said to his uncle, with the innocent wisdom only children possess. "But Dr. Johnson isn't scary. She gives the best high fives." The comment broke the ice, causing even Sarah to crack a small smile. Parker finally looked up, seeing not a threat or a stereotype, but a woman who would sacrifice her own comfort to save his family member. Meanwhile, the hospital board had called an emergency meeting. They were reviewing security footage from the past 6 months, uncovering multiple instances where minority medical staff had faced similar discrimination from law enforcement and even patients. Sarah's case had opened a floodgate of stories that could no longer be ignored. The community response continued to grow. Local businesses began displaying signs reading, "We stand with Dr. Johnson." The elementary school where Tommy attended invited Sarah to speak about her job, turning a negative incident into an inspiring career day that showed children of all backgrounds that they could become whatever they dreamed. During her presentation, Sarah noticed Officer Parker standing at the back of the assembly hall, in civilian clothes. He watched as children of all races crowded around her, asking questions about becoming doctors. The sight affected him more deeply than any sensitivity training could. One little girl, who looked remarkably like a younger version of Sarah, asked if police officers would stop her from becoming a doctor. Before Sarah could respond, Parker stepped forward. In front of the entire school, he addressed the girl's fear, acknowledging his mistakes and promising to be better. His voice cracked as he explained how his prejudices had almost cost his own nephew's life, if not for Dr. Johnson's skill and professionalism. Later that afternoon, Sarah received an emergency call about a multi-car accident on the highway. As she rushed to her car, she found Officer Parker's sister Emma waiting for her. Emma had joined the hospital's newly formed Community Relations Committee and was implementing changes to protect medical staff from discrimination. She handed Sarah a police escort authorization card, a new protocol developed in response to the incident. The scene at the accident was chaotic, but something had changed. The police officers present, including some who had witnessed Sarah's ordeal, immediately cleared a path for her. They worked alongside her, following her medical directions without question. Among the injured was a young police cadet who had been inspired by the incident to join the force specifically to make a difference. As Sarah worked to stabilize the victims, she noticed Officer Parker had arrived on scene. Instead of creating tension, his presence now served a different purpose. He directed his fellow officers to support the medical team, demonstrating through actions rather than words that he had learned from his mistakes. The revenge that everyone expected had transformed into something more powerful, genuine change. The day concluded with an impromptu gathering in the hospital's break room. Medical staff and police officers shared coffee and conversation, discussing ways to better understand and support each other. Sarah sat quietly, watching as the walls between two communities began to crumble, knowing that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't retaliation, but transformation. Tommy, who had stopped by with his mother for a checkup, drew a picture of his uncle and Dr. Johnson working together to help people. The simple crayon drawing would later hang in both the police station and the hospital lobby, a reminder that change often starts with seeing each other's humanity. 1 month after the incident, Cedar Grove hosted its annual community festival, but this year felt different. Dr. Sarah Johnson stood on the makeshift stage in the park, not as a victim of discrimination, but as the event's keynote speaker. The crowd before her was a sea of faces: medical professionals, law enforcement officers, and community members, all gathered to hear her story. As Sarah began to speak, she noticed Officer Parker standing at the edge of the crowd, now wearing a different kind of badge. After intense self-reflection and countless hours of community service, he had requested a transfer to the hospital's security team, wanting to protect the very people he once misjudged. His new role required him to work directly under Dr. Johnson's supervision, a fitting twist of fate. The festival had become an unexpected platform for change. Local organizations set up booths promoting unity and understanding. At one station, police officers learned basic medical procedures from hospital staff, while at another, doctors and nurses participated in community policing workshops. The barriers that once seemed insurmountable were slowly crumbling. Tommy, now fully recovered, ran between the booths with a group of diverse friends, wearing a tiny doctor's coat Sarah had given him. He'd become an unofficial mascot for the hospital's new youth program, which aimed to introduce minority children to medical careers early. His uncle watched from his security post, a proud smile replacing his former scowl. During the festival, an elderly man collapsed near the food court. The response was immediate and unified. Sarah rushed to help, while Officer Parker cleared the area and coordinated with emergency services. Their seamless cooperation drew attention from festival goers, many of whom recorded this positive interaction on their phones. The viral video of their teamwork began replacing the old footage of their confrontation. Local news crews captured the moment when Sarah successfully stabilized the patient. Instead of focusing on the medical emergency, reporters were struck by something else: the natural way the former adversaries now worked together. Parker handed Sarah equipment before she asked for it, anticipating her needs as if they'd been partners for years. The festival also unveiled a new community initiative, spearheaded by Emma, Parker's sister. She had worked with the hospital board to create a scholarship program for minority students interested in healthcare, naming it after Dr. Johnson. Sarah was moved to tears when the first recipient turned out to be the daughter of another officer who had been present during her ordeal. As evening approached, the festival transformed into a candlelight vigil for healing and understanding. Sarah found herself standing beside Parker as they both lit their candles. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The doctor and the former officer who had dragged her from her car now standing together in unity, their shadows merging in the flickering light. A group of children, led by Tommy, performed a skit they had prepared, reenacting the incident, but with a different ending, one where understanding prevailed over prejudice. Their innocent interpretation brought both laughter and reflection, showing how far the community had come in just a month. The most powerful moment came when Parker's fellow officers surprised Sarah with an honorary police shield, not as a token of authority, but as a symbol of protection and respect. In return, she presented Parker with a medical first responder certificate, acknowledging his dedication to learning and change. As the festival wound down, Sarah sat with Parker and his family at a picnic table, sharing stories and laughs as if the painful incident had happened in another lifetime. Tommy fell asleep between them, his tiny doctor's coat still on, dream of becoming both a doctor and a police officer. A dream that now seemed possible thanks to the bridges being built in Cedar Grove. The revenge that everyone had expected had transformed into something far more meaningful, a community's transformation. The viral video that had once shown division now had a sequel, one that demonstrated how justice could be achieved through understanding rather than retaliation. Cedar Grove had become a model for other communities facing similar challenges, proving that the best revenge against prejudice is progress. 3 months after the incident, Cedar Grove Memorial Hospital was buzzing with activity. Dr. Sarah Johnson stood in front of a newly renovated wing dedicated to community outreach and police medical partnership programs. The same cameras that had captured her humiliation now recorded a different story, one of triumph and transformation. The hospital's new program, born from the incident, had gained national attention. Police officers from neighboring cities were coming to Cedar Grove to learn about their innovative approach to community relations. At the center of it all was an unlikely pair, Sarah and former Officer Parker, now the hospital's head of security, teaching others about overcoming prejudice through their own experience. During one of these training sessions, an emergency call came in, a major pileup on the interstate with multiple casualties. As Sarah rushed to prepare, she noticed something remarkable. The police escorts, once a source of tension, now moved with practiced efficiency. Parker coordinated the response from the hospital's new command center, his voice steady and professional. The emergency revealed how much had truly changed. At the accident scene, police officers and medical staff worked in perfect harmony, their previous distrust replaced by mutual respect. Sarah found herself working alongside officers who had once viewed her with suspicion, now following her lead without hesitation. The media captured this synchronized response, creating a stark contrast to the viral video from 3 months ago. Back at the hospital, Tommy had become a regular visitor, not just as a patient, but as part of the new youth mentorship program. He proudly wore his custom-made uniform, half doctor's coat, half security officer's shirt, representing the bridge between two worlds that his uncle and Dr. Johnson had built. Other children in the program looked up to him, seeing hope in his story. The hospital board meeting that evening brought unexpected news. The program had caught the attention of state officials, who wanted to implement similar initiatives across all major hospitals. Sarah was asked to head the expansion, while Parker would train security teams in medical sensitivity. Their story of redemption was becoming a blueprint for systematic change. During a quiet moment in the hospital garden, Sarah found Parker sitting alone, reading letters from community members. Each envelope contained stories of how their example had inspired others to confront their own biases. One letter was from a young black medical student who had almost quit after facing discrimination, but found courage in Sarah's resilience. The evening took an emotional turn when an elderly white police officer arrived at the hospital, seeking treatment for chest pain. He was initially hesitant when he saw Sarah was his doctor, his prejudices visible in his body language. But as she treated him with the same care and professionalism, she showed everyone. His defenses crumbled. By the end of his stay, he was sharing stories with Parker about how the department needed to change. Local businesses had noticed the transformation too. The cafe where Emma had first intervened now offered free coffee to any medical staff and police officers who came in together, promoting interaction between the two groups. The walls were decorated with pictures of successful partnerships, with Sarah and Parker's story prominently featured. A documentary crew arrived to capture Cedar Grove's evolution, interviewing community members about the changes they'd witnessed. The most powerful testimony came from a group of teenage girls, a mix of races and backgrounds, who had started a club dedicated to pursuing careers in both medicine and law enforcement. They called themselves the Bridge Builders, inspired by Sarah and Parker's journey. As the day ended, Sarah watched from her office as Parker gave a tour to visiting officials. He stopped at the spot where he had once handcuffed her, now marked with a plaque promoting unity and understanding. The revenge that everyone had expected had instead become a revolution of hearts and minds, proving that the best response to injustice isn't retaliation but transformation. Tommy, who had stayed late to help with the youth program, drew another picture, this time of his uncle and Dr. Johnson teaching others. The simple artwork captured what Cedar Grove had learned, that true change doesn't come from punishment or revenge, but from the courage to transform pain into progress. 6 months after the incident, Cedar Grove had become a model city for police-community relations. Dr. Sarah Johnson was presenting at a national conference, sharing the stage with former Officer Parker. The audience sat captivated as they showed the contrast between their first encounter and their current partnership, a transformation that had inspired similar programs across the country. During their presentation, breaking news flashed across the conference screens. A major crisis was unfolding back in Cedar Grove. A school bus had overturned with children trapped inside. Without hesitation, Sarah and Parker cut their speech short, rushing back to their city. The conference attendees watched via live stream as their emergency response team demonstrated everything they'd just been teaching. At the accident scene, something remarkable happened. Police officers and medical staff moved in perfect synchronization, their actions demonstrating the trust built over months of working together. Sarah coordinated the medical response, while Parker managed crowd control and emergency access. Among the trapped children was a young girl wearing one of the Bridge Builders club t-shirts they had inspired. Tommy, now training as a junior emergency responder, helped comfort the younger children as they were rescued. His presence, half in medical gear and half in junior security uniform, helped calm the frightened kids. Parents arriving at the scene witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of Cedar Grove's integrated emergency response system. The national media descended on the city, but this time they found no controversy to exploit. Instead, they captured scenes of black and white, officers and medical staff, working seamlessly together. The revenge that some had hoped for months ago had transformed into something far more powerful, a complete reformation of community relations. Later that evening, as the last child was safely reunited with their family, an elderly reporter who had covered the original incident approached Sarah. He admitted that he had come expecting to find cracks in Cedar Grove's newfound unity, but instead discovered a genuine transformation. His article, titled From Confrontation to Cooperation, would later win a Pulitzer Prize. The hospital cafeteria became an impromptu gathering place as emergency responders, parents, and community members came together to process the day's events. Parker, still in his security uniform, served coffee alongside Sarah as they listened to parents express their gratitude. The simple act of serving others together spoke volumes about how far they'd come. A surprise visitor arrived, the police chief from a neighboring city who had been skeptical of Cedar Grove's changes. After witnessing their response to the crisis, he requested their help in implementing similar programs in his jurisdiction. The revenge of success was sweeter than any retaliation could have been. Emma, who had become the hospital's community relations director, unveiled plans for a new training center. It would be named the Parker Johnson Institute for Community Healing, combining both medical and law enforcement training under one roof. The irony of their names being joined wasn't lost on anyone who remembered their first encounter. As night fell, Sarah found herself back in the parking spot where everything had started. Parker joined her, both reflecting on how a moment of injustice had led to unprecedented change. A group of young medical students and police cadets walked by, chatting and laughing together, a sight that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Tommy, tired but proud of his role in the day's events, fell asleep in the hospital's new community room. On the wall above him hung the original viral video of the incident, next to footage of today's unified response. The contrast told a story more powerful than words, how tragedy and injustice could be transformed into opportunity and growth. The day ended with an impromptu celebration of life and change. Officers and medical staff shared stories, planned future collaborations, and celebrated their successful response to the crisis. Sarah and Parker stood together, no longer as symbols of division, but as partners in a revolution of understanding. The true revenge had been in proving that change was not only possible but sustainable, turning a moment of darkness into a beacon of hope for communities everywhere. 1 year after the incident, Cedar Grove hosted an international symposium on community transformation. The small city had become a global example of how to turn conflict into cooperation. Dr. Sarah Johnson and former Officer Parker, now both nationally recognized speakers, stood before delegates from around the world, their stories serving as a powerful testament to change. The event coincided with Tommy's school graduation, where he proudly announced his plans to pursue both medical training and law enforcement education, a dual program specifically created by the Parker Johnson Institute. His dream of bridging both worlds had inspired a new generation of students who refused to accept the old divisions. During the symposium, an unexpected moment captured everyone's attention. A police officer from another state stood up, tearfully confessing to similar prejudices he had held. He asked Sarah and Parker how they had managed to transform their relationship. Their answer was interrupted by an emergency call, a major factory fire with workers trapped inside. The response to the crisis demonstrated everything the symposium had been discussing. Police officers and medical teams moved as one unit, their coordination flawless. Sarah and Parker led their respective teams with a synchronicity that seemed almost choreographed. The international delegates watched in amazement as theory transformed into life-saving action. Among the rescued workers was a former critic of the program, someone who had initially claimed the changes were just for show. As Sarah treated him and Parker ensured his family's comfort, the man publicly retracted his criticism. His story would later become part of the Institute's training materials, a reminder that seeing is believing. The day took an unexpected turn when Emma announced the creation of a nationwide scholarship program. It would support students pursuing dual careers in medicine and law enforcement, named in honor of both Sarah and Parker. The first recipient was the daughter of the officer who had confessed his prejudices earlier that day. Local businesses had embraced the transformation so completely that Cedar Grove's economy was thriving. The city had become a destination for those seeking to learn about community healing. The cafe where Emma had first intervened was now a historical landmark, its walls covered with photos documenting the year of change. As evening approached, a special ceremony began in the hospital parking lot. The spot where Sarah had been handcuffed was transformed into a reflection garden, complete with a fountain representing the flow of change. Parker, standing beside Sarah, unveiled a plaque that read, "From this spot of darkness, light spread across our nation." Tommy, wearing his graduation robe over his dual uniform, gave a speech that moved many to tears. He spoke about watching his uncle transform from someone consumed by prejudice to a leader in community healing. His words, "Change isn't just possible, it's inevitable when we choose love over hate," became the motto of the Institute. The revenge that some had demanded a year ago had evolved into something far more powerful, a complete reformation of not just one city, but a movement spreading across the country. Sarah and Parker's story had inspired similar transformations in other communities, creating a ripple effect of positive change. As the symposium concluded, delegates witnessed one final powerful scene. A young black woman was being pulled over by a white officer on the street outside. Instead of tension, they saw the officer approach with respect, explain the reason for the stop, and even thank the woman for her patience. The incident that had sparked Cedar Grove's transformation had become unrecognizable in its new reality. The day ended with a community dinner where officers served meals alongside medical staff to local families. Sarah and Parker sat with Tommy between them, just as they had a year ago, but now surrounded by hundreds of others following in their footsteps. The revenge of success had proven far more satisfying than any retaliation could have been. As night fell over Cedar Grove, the lights of the Parker Johnson Institute illuminated the sky, a beacon of hope for other communities seeking change. The viral video that had once shown their worst moment now ended every presentation alongside footage of their greatest achievements, proving that sometimes the best revenge is living well and helping others do the same.